Hey everybody, Kyle, or Alientude, here with another sword review. This time it's Balaur Arms' 15th century Italian longsword. For those of you who don't know me, let me preface all of this by explaining a little bit about myself. I am an amateur collector of swords. I have no training in historical or modern swordsmanship. I'm not a student of blacksmithing or history. I'm just a video game geek who happens to really enjoy collecting swords. So, Balaur Arms. Who are they? What do they make? Where can they be bought? Balaur Arms is a forge based in India, I believe, that has partnered with Cult of Athena to produce a fairly limited range of budget blades. At the time of recording, there are 13 different models you can buy on Cult of Athena, although there are rumors new models are coming within the next month or so. There's not a whole lot of reviews of Balaur Arms' swords out there right now, probably because they're relatively new on the scene. That said, the 15th century Italian longsword that I'm going to be talking about today is probably their most reviewed one. I have another Balaur Arms sword that I've posted a gallery of, and I do plan on doing a review of it soon. For now, though, let's talk about the 15th century Italian longsword. I bought this sword secondhand, and it was a factory second. That basically means Balaur Arms recognized some flaws in the overall construction that caused it to be sold at a considerable discount. I'll get into the specific flaws of this particular sword in a little bit. A normal one of these swords retails at Cult of Athena for $249.95 US dollars, but unfortunately they're currently out of stock. I'd imagine when KOA receives the rumored new models, there's a good chance the shipment will also restock their existing lines, although that's purely speculation on my part. There is at least one munitions grade version of this sword available on KOA right now, selling at $200. If you're not familiar with Cult of Athena's munition grade offerings, this is when the item passed whatever QA was done at production, but when Cult of Athena inspected it, they identified some flaws that are what they consider enough to keep it from being sold at full price. I've owned a few munitions grade swords from them, and most of the time you have to really inspect the item to find the flaws. That said, I can't say for sure that if you bought one of these, it would be fully functional. Balaur Arms swords come unsharpened by default. The original owner of this sword had it sharpened by Cult of Athena at time of purchase. This sword seems to me to be fairly representative of an oakshot type 18B. 18B swords typically range from hand and a half to full two-handed, general-purpose cut and thrust blades. Some, like this one, are hollow ground, producing a strong ridge down the center of the blade. It's not marketed as any specific type, however. This is just my amateur attempt at categorizing it. Remember, I'm not a historian. Now let's get one more thing out of the way before getting into the meat of this review. Everything I say is my amateur opinion about this specific 15th century Italian longsword only. I can't speak to the quality of other examples, as this is the only one I've handled. I'm going to start by looking at the pommel first. This is representative of an oakshot type T pommel, also known as a scent stopper. It's peened to the tang, and the peen is worked into the shape of the pommel. The lines don't quite match up with the rest of the pommel. Overall, it kind of looks like a peen block, but not quite. This isn't the cleanest peen I've seen, but it's nowhere near the worst. A little more attention to detail would go a long way here, though. There's quite a few marks and discolorations on the pommel. That's the way it came when I bought it secondhand. I think these marks would clean up pretty easily, I just haven't taken the time to do so yet. I find the overall shape of the pommel attractive. Scent stoppers are my favorite style. This one, though, is a little cruder than a lot of others I've seen. It's pretty damn large, and the lines waver, but the edges at least are all nicely chamfered, and I don't feel any irritation when my hand interacts with it. By the way, don't mind the hairs in some of these pictures. Cat fur gets everywhere. Moving on to the grip. This is a wood core with a fine cord wrap covered in leather. It's got an oval shape and a riser in the middle. There's a gentle taper from the riser to the pommel. The overall feel is comfortable, and I have no problems indexing the blade. When I bought this secondhand, the seller indicated one of the reasons this was listed as a factory second is that the leather wrap was a little too short. There's just a touch of the wood core peeking out near the pommel. I haven't had any issues with this minor flaw. If I were more skilled with leather, I would consider putting a new wrap on it, but frankly, it's plenty usable as is. The fine cord wrap gives the grip a texture that I really like. Having handled several swords, including another Balaur Arms sword, with thicker cord wraps, I find I greatly prefer the smaller cord used by the Italian longsword. It feels great barehanded and with gloves. The seam in the leather is visually but not tactilely noticeable. It's close to a straight seam. I've seen much more expensive swords where the line is considerably sloppier. This is more aesthetics than function, but hey, swords look cool, and I doubt any sword owner ignores that aspect. There is some fraying at the seam, where the grip meets the crossguard, and of course where the leather wrap came up short. This does give me some concern that with continued use, the grip could degrade and need repair. Of course, that's going to be true of any sword. Historically, swords were re-hilted quite often. I think this grip is just a little further along in its lifespan. The crossguard is in the style of an oakshot Type 8. It's a little thick and chonky in the center. Ideally, the shape would be refined a bit more, but these are often the kind of corners cut to make a sword affordable. The fit of the blade to the crossguard is quite good, although it's not perfectly centered. There's more gap on one side than the other. Overall, though, the gap is very small for a budget sword. Swords in this price range usually have a considerably worse fit than this Italian longsword. This one's pretty impressively well fit. Like the seam in the grip, this is more about aesthetics than function, and historically sword fit to the crossguard was all over the place, especially as swords were re-hilted often. Still, it is nice when the gap is minimal. When my hand bumps into the crossguard in use, it doesn't bother me at all thanks to the nicely chamfered edges. The corners on the blade side are sharper. I can feel them if I wrap a finger around the crossguard when using the sword one-handed, but it's not painful or anything. The Balaur Arms 15th century Italian longsword comes with a leather-wrapped wood core scabbard that generally matches the color of the grip. It has a steel chate, stitched rain flaps, and several decorative risers. Getting a scabbard with a budget sword is kind of an odd conundrum for me. On the one hand, I feel no sword is complete without a matching scabbard, and I greatly prefer having them to help protect from dust settling on the oiled surface. However, a good scabbard is costly to make. If you take a look at the high-end scabbard makers out there, such as DBK Customs or Christian Fletcher, their scabbards end up costing more than the swords themselves. The amount of time a good scabbard takes to make is daunting. When budget production swords come with a scabbard, I imagine it typically means they were made with a set of parameters that match the sword's ideal measurements, but I doubt there's much, if any, time taken to fit a specific sword to a specific scabbard. This is kind of a long-winded way of saying that my expectations for a budget sword scabbard are not particularly high. I want the sword to fit into the scabbard without absurd amounts of rattling, and I prefer some retention. Ideally, the sword will slide out with some gentle shaking. The fit of this sword and scabbard is decent. There's clearly a better fit with the sword in one way, as it has less rattle and good retention, whereas if I reverse the sword, it rattles quite a bit and there's no retention at all. I'm betting this is a side effect of this being a factory second and the slight warp in the blade. More on that soon. Overall, I find myself liking this scabbard. It does the job it's intended to do, and the fit is good enough when I insert the sword in the optimal direction. It's a rather plain scabbard, but it looks nice enough, and for the price range the Italian longsword sits in, I think it's pretty good. Time to talk about the business end, the blade. I've put up some measurements while I ramble. This is a hollow ground blade, which is fairly unusual in budget swords due to the complexity of the grind. It has a noticeable secondary bevel, which is a result of Cult of Athena's sharpening service. This is probably the best example of KOA's sharpening I've experienced. The edge is very sharp, but it has some meat behind it to keep it durable. Keep in mind this sword is second-hand. The previous owner indicated he did some work on the polish, taking the shininess down and removing some rougher grinding marks. As I mentioned earlier, there's a very slight warp to this blade. Near the tip it angles off to the side just a touch. I tried but couldn't really capture it in photo or video. There's also a bit of an odd geometry to the profile. After the ricasso, the profile is straight for an inch or two before beginning to taper. That first bit of the taper is more acute than the rest, however, which gives it what I consider a weird look. It doesn't affect the function of the blade at all. The central ridge of the blade is pretty straight, though it's not perfect. There's some waver to it here and there, and it's not as well defined as it could be. The surface of the blade shows some ripples and unevenness. Whether that's leftover impressions from hammers or uneven grinding, I couldn't tell you. Pretty much everything I've said with any negative connotations before and now are all really just about aesthetics, not function. Which brings me to function. This sword handles beautifully. It's not particularly light, but it doesn't feel heavy in the hand, and holding it, you can tell just it wants to be swung. The point of balance is pretty close to the Crossguard, which lends itself to great control at just a small cost of cutting power. That's always going to be the trade-off. Blades that are more forward-heavy are great at chopping, but they tend to be more difficult to control and more tiring to use. This is what I consider to be a full two-handed longsword. Even so, it's surprisingly effective held in one hand. The grip is a little too long for my taste for a bastard sword, but it can still be moved well. The hollow grind of the sword produces a central ridge that helps keep the blade stiff without giving up too much flexibility. The sword is listed as made from 5160 high carbon spring steel with a spring temper. I've seen reports online that some people have issues with their version of the Balaur Arms 15th century Italian longsword being too flexible and whippy. I'm happy to say that's not the case with this one. It flexes nicely and springs back to true. I've even dinged the sword against concrete on one terribly errant cut, and it took no damage whatsoever. It looks like they nailed the heat treatment on this one. Before I talk about cutting, let me reiterate that I am a complete novice. I have no formal or informal training in swordsmanship. I plan on joining a local HEMA club once conditions improve, but until then, I'm just winging it. I'm well aware my form is terrible. Any failed cuts you might see are much more likely to be my fault than the sword's. Right now my targets are pool noodles and water bottles. When I feel like my skills are worth the expense, I might graduate to tatami mats, but for now I feel like it would just be a waste of money. All that being said, how does it cut? Well, whenever I get my cutting stuff set up, my wife asks me which sword I'm going to use. If it's the Italian longsword, I just tell her it's my cheat code. This sword cuts beautifully. Every time I use it, I'm amazed at how easily it slices through whatever I put in front of it. It's light, quick to move around, sharp enough to cut cleanly, and strong enough to take nothing more than minor scratches, something that you're never going to avoid when actually using a sword. When used one-handed, I find the most success with my thumb along the back of the grip, rather than around it. I think this is a saber grip, but I'm honestly not sure. I definitely had some issues cutting pool noodles one-handed, but again, I'm confident that's my lack of skill, and not the blade's fault. It's when wielded two-handed that this sword really comes alive. It feels like it will cut just about anything, even with my poor form. This could actually be a bad thing. The sword could very easily end up reinforcing bad technique because it just works. It's one of the reasons I try to avoid using it too much. I want to improve, not just be happy cutting with this one sword. As if you couldn't tell after all that gushing, I really like my Balaur Arms 15th century Italian longsword. It's one of my go-to cutters, and performance-wise, it hangs with my A-trims and Albions. The fit and finish, aesthetics, and overall look certainly can't match them, of course. This is a sword that costs a quarter of those blades, or even less. Considering that, and that this is a factory second that I bought used, I'm extremely impressed by the performance. If the one I have is a good representation of the entire line, then I think it's easily worth the asking price. This sword is the primary reason I bought another Balaur Arms sword, and the reason I plan on looking closely at the new models when they come out. One of the pictures Balaur Arms teased us with looks to me like a Kriegsmesser, which can be very difficult to find in the budget range, and it's a type of sword I've been wanting to acquire. Hopefully Cult of Athena gets their shipment soon. Alright, that's going to wrap up this review. Thank you for listening all the way through an amateur's rambling thoughts on one of his swords. If you happen to find some value to this review, please consider giving a like and a subscribe. Until next time, Alien Toot out.